So Jeff is going to inspect a strong hive and then a weak hive, and we're thinking that's about an hour. We are in Jeff and Nora's Lupine Lane Apiary. You can see the picture of Nora, but we're going to try now to switch over to the camera. And Mike, you can take over. I guess it goes without saying we've never done this before, so please be patient with us.
Okay, first, a look around the apiary. And now Jeff's going to light the smoker.
That field of lupins, I hope you got a chance to see that. That's just phenomenal.
Tiny bit of shavings to start with.
So there was a great class at bee school on how to light a smoker. Did you go to that, Jeff?
Yes, I've done a smoker demo for a couple of bee school sessions.
Okay, Jeff, try that again.
I usually encourage people to be really slow, to add, patient when they're adding fuel, just so you keep the fire going and you don't end up smothering it, and you keep a strong fire in there. When no one's watching, my smoker will sometimes keep burning for an hour or two after I finish. It sometimes doesn't work as well when I've got people watching.
That's good. We could even hear the smoker.
First hive that I'm going to open that gets fully suited up is a hive that overwintered, and it started to look like it was about to swarm, so I decided to do a split on the spot, and I happened to find the queen, so I thought I would do the split by removing the queen from the hive and let the bees hatch out some of the capped queen cells. And I actually took a couple of frames with capped queen cells on them and put them in a third hive. So I had the queen in a new hive with a couple of frames of brood and a couple of frames with queen cells on them. And I was thinking if I left queen cells in the original hive, everything would be fine. It didn't turn out that way. I checked a little while later, and the bees were quite testy and quite queenly. So I introduced a new queen. I think it was about 2 weeks. Maybe it was only a week ago. I usually put a little puff of smoke underneath the cover.
Mike's moving the camera so we can see.
This hive is sometimes a little tricky to open because the bees seem to be taking the upper entrance rather than the lower entrance, which is fine, but it just means as soon as I start taking supers off, there's a whole lot of bees trying to find their way in and it's not there anymore. I set the cover aside upside down because that's where I'm going to put supers that I take off.
The participants is a mix of very experienced and new people.
just setting the inner cover down carefully. And I'll just give them a little bit of smoke. They seem relatively calm so far. I like this frame rest. It's very handy. And I usually start taking out the frame number 2 because it tends to have less activity on it. I don't take out frame number 1 because that one usually propolized tight to the super. This is frame number 2, and it's got a little bit of capped honey on the top, and almost all the cells, you can see that shiny liquid in there. That's fresh nectar that they brought in on both sides. Not a huge number of bees, but looks pretty good. I'll set that one aside and just go take a look out in the middle. This is a little funny. It's the frame right in the middle of the hive, 5 or 6, and there's no nectar in it almost. There's a little bit over here. There's some pollen in here. If you can see a little bit of color in there. Well, I think I've seen all I need to see in this particular super. And I did put a queen excluder on here because at one point there was some larvae in the honey super that I put on first. Normally I'd pick it up like this, but if I put my hand there, it's going to be in a thicket of bees.
And we see that you're not wearing gloves.
I usually don't wear gloves. It seems to just make it easier. But I keep them quite handy in case I open up a hive that gets testy. But I would say 90% of the time I don't need them. Same approach here, taking out frame number 2. This looks pretty nice. It's maybe about a third full of freshly capped honey. You can see all the nice white wax there. And the rest of it is all chock full of nectar.
So we can actually see the nectar sort of reflecting in the sun if you get the angle just right. So we can see that all the cells have nectar in them, yeah. We get a little sparkle occasionally.
And if you're looking in close, you can actually see some of these bees are drones just wandering around in here. I had one, I just lost it. See this guy right here? See how bigger and blockier he is?
Mike, can you zoom in at all?
If I'm really sure it's a drone, since drones don't have stingers, I can pick them up and not worry about getting stung.
And you pick them up by the wing?
I wasn't so careful. I just grabbed them. I'll do the same thing here. Take a frame out of the middle just to see what that looks like. This is interesting. Again, they've got some nectar in there, but there's a lot more pollen than anything else in there.
Just to remind people who may have joined late, you're going to be muted and your video is off, but you can ask questions. Please ask questions via the chat. Questions are always good for people doing presentations.
Some of this frame at one point might have had a little bit of larva in it. Perhaps that's why they're doing that. But I've had a queen excluder on for a couple of weeks now, so there's no brood anywhere above the queen excluder.
So normally the pollen would be in the brood chambers instead of the honey supers. Is that right?
There's a question, Jeff.
Yes, you find pollen everywhere, but the normal pattern, hopefully we'll see one today. If you get down to the brood chamber, you'd see that semicircle of brood in the middle. And in the very upper corners, there might be some honey. And in between that and the brood, you'd see a lot of pollen. I'm stacking my the supers that I take off on the cover, which is flipped upside down, and I'm setting them down kitty corner, so the only thing I'm really squishing is those bees on the very edge. I think I'll just jump to the middle here and take out one frame and see what it looks like. Again, it almost looks like they're preparing this area for the queen to lay, because there's very little nectar in the middle, and you can tell this is kind of brown. It probably had larvae in it at one point, but there is nectar in both sides. There's also a bunch of drones on here, but if you think about it, the queen excluder not only excludes the queen, but it also keeps the drones from getting down into the lower part of the hive. So they tend to end up congregating up here. I would say that super I just took off feels like it's about half full. There's my queen excluder.
So Pete wants to know how you managed to arrange such nice weather for this.
Actually, I've been hoping for rain because I've got a garden here that is really dry. Again, I'm taking out frame number 2 now that I'm down in the upper brood chamber. This is a very old comb, I think, and it looks like there's some of last year's honey there. You can see how dark it is where it's capped on the sides, but there's also a lot of nectar in here. And this side, there's a mixture of mostly nectar, but there's a few cells in there with yellow and orange pollen. So I'll set that one down on my frame rest and work my way through it, hoping to see some good brood frames. Since there was no brood on that one, I'll skip ahead a little to frame 3 to 4. And this is where it'd be nice if I could see some brood, but again, it's mostly pollen in a few cells and a lot of nectar. And about the same thing over here. I was hoping I would see a lot of brood here.
When was the last time you went into this hive?
I think I probably went in and checked and make sure the queen was released sometime last week. This has got, you can see sprinkled cells of pollen again. More pollen over here, both yellow and orange, with still a lot of nectar. This looks about the same. It does look like they were kind of keeping the cells open for the queen to lay in there, but don't see any sign of brood. And my eyes aren't that good, so I couldn't see if there were eggs in there anyway. So I think I'll go down to the lower one. One of the things that I would do if I was checking for swarm cells on here is I would take this upper deep this tape is over a little hole. I'll have to retape it when we're done. Normally I would tip it the other way, but since the camera's back here, if you take a hive like this, just pull it up a little bit and then tip it up. If you look along the bottom here, if this was about to swarm or if it had a lot of queen cells, you'd see them prominently sticking down here. And I don't see any at all, so if it did swarm a while back, there's nothing there now. Getting a little busier, so I'm going to apply just a little bit of smoke. Usually I find that when I'm going through a hive, the deeper into the hive you get, the testier the bees get. But so far they're being fine. They've packed away a lot of pollen and some nectar on this one, but it's mostly pretty light. But it is framed too, so I wasn't really expecting a lot. And since I'm looking for brood, I'm going to skip over to strain 4. So I'm starting to get concerned that my queen is not laying at all. So right now, without looking at a couple more frames, it looks like I need to put a new queen in here quickly. There's a lot of empty cells in case the queen's ready to lay. There's also considerably less bees in here than the last time I had it open. That's completely empty. That's got some pollen in it, but also no sign of brood.
So there was a question, is there any chance if the queen is in the brood box that you just put on the super, she might travel down to the super? I don't understand that.
I would say there's a small chance that could happen. I'm not too worried about it. Plenty of bees working the cells, but I don't see any sign of brood.
Well, it's a good thing we had to do a hive opening today, huh?
Okay. So you notice this frame looks quite a bit different. There is the cap cells there are all capped worker brood, and you can see some white larvae in some of the cells. So there must be a queen in here someplace. Over here, you can see where these cells are sticking up more. That's all drone comb. And the same thing, there's capped and there's a few uncapped cells that are going to end up being drones. If the hive was this low on bees, I would think the queen should be focusing on worker bees and not drone at this point. There's a lot of nice white larvae right in there.
Is this queen marked?
I can't remember. Sometimes I get marked queens and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I mark my own as I'm going along, but sometimes I just leave them. This is another frame with some brood on it. I would have liked to have seen a lot more, but at least it's clear that there is a queen in there, or that she's been there within the last few days. I'm taking a quick look for the queen. When I look for a queen, I kind of sweep across methodically like that, instead of just trying to look at the whole frame at once, because you never see anything that way.
And you'd expect to see her next to the most recent larva or eggs, right?
Yes.
Although she, of
These
course,
are-
can run
these are
anywhere.
frames where she's most likely to be. But queens tend to kind of run for the darkest corner sometimes when you're opening a hive and looking for them. There's a little bit of, I think it's open brood over here. And some of the cells, I think you can see some a milky white substance where they put in some royal jelly in preparation for the cell. But I don't see the queen here either. You can probably tell from looking at this hive on the camera that the bees are getting a little bit testier. And I have opened up a lot of frames, and I'm deep into the bottom brood chambers. I don't see the queen here either, but as long as I've got uncapped brood, I'm pretty sure she's in there someplace. And I'll call this a hive that just did a very slow start. So I probably want to check on this in about a week and make sure there's a lot more brood in there. Like, how am I doing for time?
Time, it is 1:30, 1:31. We got started a little late, didn't we, Ellen?
Yes.
So I'm putting things back on. I usually set a super on just kind of kitty corner. So I'm squishing in the minimal number of bees and then just kind of slide slowly into place. I'll come back up later and tape up that hole. I've got a couple more supers that are ready to go, so I'll probably replace that. One of my favorite mistakes is to put all the honey supers back on and find I haven't put the queen excluder on yet. I won't make that mistake today.
On this hive.
These honey supers are actually heavier than the deeps.
And those are mediums?
These are mediums. I use only deeps and mediums. I think I have one shallow someplace that I put on as a last resort when I discover I've run out of mediums.
Everyone's being very shy about asking questions.
I usually put something right here, both summer and winter, to raise up the outer cover a little bit just to get some ventilation going through there. In the summer, it's good for cooling and evaporation when they're evaporating the nectar. And you can see they've propolized my queen cages, which is one of my favorite props for venting.
Mike usually uses a small rock.
I've never actually had a cover blow off on a hive, but I've always tried to be good about keeping something like a serious rock on it.
Oh, I meant he uses a rock to prop the cover up.
So that works too. I'm going to skip now to this hive over here, which is the one that I put the queen in when I tried to do the split. My smoker's still going.
So this is the original queen from the hive that you just opened.
Again, just a little smoke under before I take the cover off.
Answer my question again, Owen.
So this is the queen that came out of the hive that you just opened.
Yes, so this is a queen that was overwintered at 1 year at least. Yeah, probably just 1 year.
And she was a strong layer, obviously.
Yeah, when I did the split on that hive we just looked at, it was totally full of bees. They were just boiling out all the way up through every single frame. This is one where I just put a brand new super on, maybe about a week ago, and they haven't touched it. So it's a little concerning that they haven't started working up here yet. Hardly any bees up here, and there was not a queen excluder between here. This is meant to be a brood chamber. There's so few bees in here, I'm going to skip right down to the bottom. I may have to open up a third hive today to show you a decent brood pattern. Not a real lot of bees for a hive that has had a queen in it all the time. There's some relatively freshly capped honey in the corners, upper corners, and mostly nectar in the rest of it. And the outside is pretty much dry. So it doesn't seem like there have been a lot of bees in here. Okay, there. Here's a pretty good brood frame. Most of the frame is got capped worker brood. It would be a little nicer if there weren't so many holes in the middle. Some of those holes, just a few of them, have uncapped larvae in it. And about the same thing on this side. Lots of brood, so the population should be picking up quickly in the next week if there's a few more frames like this in there. And I'm taking a quick look for the queen, but I don't see her. This has got some worker brood over here, capped worker brood. You can see a few cells of colored pollen. And this looks sort of like they started to make a queen cell, but it's not really big enough to hold a queen. I'll break it open just to see if there's anything in there. It looks like there might have been something in there, but it's not really big enough to be a full queen cell.
And it's right in the middle of the frame. Just
Yeah, no, there wasn't really anything in there. There's a good view of some uncapped larvae there. Or actually, maybe that's just royal jelly in there. Okay, there we go. If you look carefully here, down near my left hand, the queen in here is marked in green. You can see her scurrying around there, right there.
you zoom in, Michael.
How's that?
That's a good zoom, but I don't see her. Oh, I think I caught a flash. Oh, there she is. There she is.
This is
To your
one
right.
that I marked myself. I can tell because it's not a very good marking job, and that's also the pen I've been using so far this spring. So she looks perfectly healthy to me. There's again a lot of worker brood up here, so I think everything is good. So since I've seen the queen and I've seen a lot of capped and uncapped brood, I think everything's good in there. I think I'll close this one up, and I guess we have time. I could open up a third hive.
We got
Got another 20 minutes.
I just got stung for the first time. But on the whole, this hive has been very gentle. First thing I do when I get stung is I scrape out the stinger. And then a lot of times what I'll do is put a little smoke on it, just so I'm covering up the alarm scent. So with that, like 5 or 6 frames of capped and uncapped brood in there, there'll be a lot of young bees in there in the next week or so. And the younger bees are the ones who will draw out the comb. They are the best at producing wax.
Let's get your inner cover.
So what would you see that would trigger you to add a honey super?
I'd wait until they've at least drawn out most of those frames and started, the queen started laying in there. But right now there's plenty of room, they just haven't drawn it out. Like, can you reach all the way down to the last hive?
Maybe.
Since it's been almost an hour, I'm gonna check my smoker and see if there's enough fuel in here.
I guess more.
Mike's gonna regroup to so we can move down to that end hive. My smoker is a little bit too full of creosote. I need to get out a torch and burn some of it off so I can close this tightly. We're waiting momentarily for a little bit longer extension cord. Good time to ask questions, I guess. I think this is another overwintered hive. Would it be easier if I just went to the next hive, Mike?
Nope.
I was going to check this end hive because that was a swarm that I captured about a month ago, I think. It was not one of mine. It was a friend of mine called me and was a swarm that he wasn't interested in.
In case anybody's interested in how we're doing this, Jeff's apiary is about 150 feet from the house, so we ran an internet cable from his router out into the middle of the yard and have a second router there. And then extension cords running down. Once you get the Wi-Fi outside, it goes pretty far. So I'm actually sitting in the car where I can block things off and see the video. Mike has the camera on a tripod and is trying to see. He can't really see because it's so bright in the apiary. But he's doing pretty well at pointing it. So when was this swarm captured?
I think it was about a month ago. I'd have to go back and look at my notes.
So it was a pretty big swarm.
It was pretty good size, but it had been outside for a couple of days, and one of those days it actually snowed lightly on it.
Oh my goodness. I'd like to point out the Lupine backdrop. That's really amazing. Lupine Lane apiary. And the lupins are incredible.
I don't think I've opened this one in a couple of weeks. I did put 2 honey supers on it and a queen excluder. This is kind of disappointing. This frame is totally dry with only a tiny handful of bees on it. This is right out of the middle on the second, so the top of 2 honey supers. You can see a little bit of shiny nectar right in the middle there, but again, not very many bees for there being a flow on right now.
Sam has commented that he can actually see better at the virtual hive opening than an actual hive opening.
I'm gonna just jump right out to the middle here and go against my usual approach of taking out frame number 2 first. This looks a little better. It's packed with nectar and there are a lot more bees working it. Same thing over on this side. So I think at least in another 2 weeks, this will be full of capped honey.
I'm guessing the lupins are one of their favorite targets these days, huh?
Can't quite hear everything.
Give us that question again, Alan.
So do they, are the lupins one of their favorite flowers these days?
Actually, honeybees don't seem to pay much attention to the lupins at all. I see way more bumblebees on the lupins than I do honeybees. Nora has guessed that the flow right now is, a lot of it's coming out of, well, maybe it was last week, the black locusts that were blooming. You could see a lot of them along 128. So here I'm in frame 2, and it's got what looks to me like old honey that was overwintered, and almost everything on here looks like drone brood. You can see the protruding capped drone brood cells. And the other side, there's another patch of capped and a few uncapped cells with drone brood. And here's a sort of typical semicircle brood pattern. And it looks like all the brood in here has hatched out. And the bees have kind of cleaned up those cells so they're ready for the queen to lay in there again when she gets to it. And you can see a little bit of pollen along the edges here. Not very much, but there's yellow and orange in there. And then the capped honey up in the top, and particularly in the corners. So that semicircle is reserved for the queen to lay. There's a pretty nice brood pattern. There's a few more empty cells in there, but they could have just been cells that just recently hatched out.
There's a question of whether you think that the low rainfall this spring has had any impact on the honey production.
I think it's starting to right now, and I would be surprised if there's much nectar coming in the next week or so, because it's been really dry here for about 3 weeks, I think. And last summer, when most of the beekeepers around here had spectacular flows, my honey yield last summer was the best I've had in 20 years. And I think it was mostly because we had nice even rains throughout the summer and the flow just never stopped. Most years I figure it stopped by around the 4th of July. Here's another good view on this frame. See if you guys can spot what I'm looking at before I point it out. Might be good for another close-up. Whoops.
Can you do a close-up, Michael?
Trying.
So Mike has the camera on a tripod and has to pick up the whole thing. You see a
Right
green
in
dot.
almost the middle, you can see another queen that I marked in green.
Do you see her?
Yep, a little higher, Michael, a little more towards Jeff's right hand.
More towards what?
Jeff's right hand. Yep, that's good.
So she looks like a nice big fat queen, and looks like she's moving around perfectly healthy. If you think about it, queens aren't used to being out in the daylight. They go out for their mating flight, and that's pretty much the end of their daylight. The rest of the time they spend in the dark. So she probably doesn't like it too much out here. But now that I've seen this, I think this hive looks fine to me. I'm a little surprised that there isn't more honey in there. I'll put this frame back particularly carefully so I don't crush the queen. Maybe I'll jump over here just to take out one more frame, see what the brood looks like. If I was just doing my own hive check, as soon as I'd seen a couple of good frames of brood, and particularly if I'd seen the queen, I wouldn't go any farther. But since we're doing a hive opening, I'll look at another frame. Here's a really nice brood pattern. This is all worker brood, and drone comb over here, capped. Some more drone comb over here, capped. And this is maybe a better display. If you look just between the worker brood, capped worker brood, and the honey in the corner, you can see pollen.
Are there any bees hatching that we could do a close-up on?
It's a mixture of yellow and...
Ellen asked if there are any bees hatching.
That we could do a close-up.
I don't see any in this frame. I don't see it in here actively hatching out either. But that's a nice brood pattern, and it's sort of a classic frame with the honey and the pollen around the edges. There's not really very much pollen in here. For the beginners, you can see how effectively I use this J hook to pull out the frames, because most of my hives are older frames with a lot of propolis on them, and they get stuck really easily. There's another nice brood pattern. This frame has a lot more pollen on it. Again, it's a mixture of yellow and orange. You can see right there by my thumb. And then the other side of the frame is more drone comb. But that's a nice looking frame to me. And this side looks pretty good too. Again, there's where you see the white, there's some uncapped brood in there. So this hive looks fine to me. There isn't really any need for me to go down to the lower brood chamber, because I've seen pretty much everything I need to see to know if things are okay.
So to use the J hook, you break the hives loose first and then pull, right?
Well, I use the other end to kind of pry between the frames, like that, just to loosen them up from the other frames. And the J hook goes out in the very end between the side piece to the frame and the edge of the box. And you can slip it under there, and then there's a little notch here that you can put against the next frame, and it just lifts the frame out very nicely. And you can't do that with the ones that don't have that J hook. So this is always my hive tool of choice.
There's a question of whether you're ever inclined to destroy drone comb.
I don't see any real reason to. You don't need it. It's only good for the drones that come out, and they'll be mating with other queens. Not any of mine because I don't have any unmated queens in here. But I don't really see any need to do that. There's plenty of worker brood in here. So if they want to make drones, that's fine. It may be helping either feral colonies where there's a queen that needs to be mated or some of my neighbors' bees. One thing I'll point out on this, I have two of these. One of them is, this one is, the inserts are offset here. My other one, they're way out at the very end. So when you go like this to put it in, the insert comes out right at the end of the frames. And that's the tightest spot in the hive. It's really a lot of work to get them in there. This design is far superior. It just drops right in usually.
So Ken commented to the group that he sometimes destroys the drone comb intentionally as a way to check for mites. So Ken, I've unmuted you. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so briefly, you'll see drone comb occasionally on the bottom of frames, and as you're splitting boxes, you'll rip open that drone comb, especially the older drone comb, you know, say 23, 24, 25 days is where you'll see varroa mites actively roaming around on that white pupa. And if you're concerned at that point, you can even take an uncapping fork and pull drone pupa out of their cells to check for drones or to check for varroa. If you see it on those, it's a good indication or a good precursor to lead you into checking using an alcohol wash for your mite load.
Thanks, Ken. And Pete, you want to talk about putting in drone, using drone as a trap for mites?
Well, actually, it was Chris that typed that, but Pete's here also. If you put in a frame, you know, a short frame, shallow frame into a deep super, that will quite often draw just drone comb on the bottom of it. And then that's the drone comb you take out to check for mites, and you cut that off the bottom. Or you can put in a frame specifically made for trapping drone comb or growing drone brood, and you can check for mites as well.
So I pull out my uncapping scratcher, which I don't use to uncap honey, but it is very handy for this particular exercise. So this is the drone comb here. I can't tell what age it is. I think Stan would say that you need to be at the point where you can see their eyes.
You have to wear your glasses for that.
Got about maybe a dozen or 15 drone larvae here that I pulled out. I don't see any varroa mites. They are visible. They're small, but they are visible. You can just barely see them if there were any here, but I don't see any, so that's a good sign. So, and since this was a swarm, there was a very clear break in the brood pattern earlier in the summer. When I first set them up, there would be no comb anywhere, let alone drone comb. So about a month ago, there was no place at all for the varroa mites to breed. There's another batch of drone larvae. And again, out of maybe 20 larvae there, I don't see any varroa mites at all. This is not a real reliable test, but it's certainly a quick and easy test. The alcohol wash or the sugar roll is a lot more accurate. But that works sometimes, and you can see the little reddish brown varroa mite. They stand out really clearly on the white larva. Thank you, Ken, for that reminder.
Hey,
And
go ahead.
back together, and I guess we're done. Unless
Okay.
anyone has any
Thank-
questions while we're out at the apiary.
Don't see any other questions, but I think I can probably speak for everyone to thank you very much. That was fantastic.